Hello, everyone. It's Tuesday, so it's API review time. It's spring, so we have blocking issues, and nicely, it doesn't overflow my screen today. So I guess technically it never has. But all right, since we're still in the red, we still want to go quickly. Where quickly for us means not all that fast. All right, avoid unnecessary allocations when using FileStream 15088.
Yeah, could you please scroll to the bottom? There is the actual proposal. Sorry, like a little bit up. Yeah, so a short introduction. So I was absent last meeting, so I'm not sure how in detail you have discussed the proposal of adding a buffer to FileStream options, but to tell the long story short, we have removed almost all allocations from FileStream, and the last one is the allocation of the buffer used for the buffering. Buffering is disabled by default, and when you try to read 1K of bytes, what we do is we allocate a 4K buffer and read 4K bytes from disk and give you the 1K that you asked for. Yeah. So by doing that, we reduce the number of syscalls. However, we allocate the memory. And this has been reported by some of our users that don't like the fact that we allocate the memory. So we have a few options to mitigate that. So the first one that I would like to propose is extending the FileStream options with a possibility for the user to specify the buffer. So the buffer would be a memory of bytes. It could be a buffer rented from the RI pool. It could be unmanaged memory. The API is quite simple. The problem is that by introducing this possibility, we cannot, run away from bugs introduced by the users by misusing the memory. So in theory, someone could rent the buffer from the pool provided to the file stream, but never return it to the pool, for example. So we could exhaust the array pool. Or someone could allocate unmanaged memory and free it when we are still using the memory. So the risks are definitely there. And I would be very happy to hear what you think about this. There is an alternative design. In the alternative design, we could extend the file options enumeration with pool buffer. So by doing that, we would let the users specify that they want us to rent the memory and return it on our own when we are done with FileStream, so namely in FileStream.dispose. The disadvantage compared to the first proposal is that it limits us only to managed memory. And some of our super users, like for example, RavenDB folks, they wanted to have the possibility to specify unmanaged memory.
So, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So my view is that as much as I'd like for this to be in .NET, I think that it's something that we likely want to talk with Mayoni and Jan about and come up with a generalized pattern that we can use across all APIs where this would be applicable. I don't want us to come up with something that happens to work with FileStream and then have it not work when we go and look at, like, say, buffers later on.
Then when you say something more general, like what do you have in mind? Because I mean, what could we do better than passing in a memory of byte?
So there's other patterns. So the main problem with the memory of byte approach is you are effectively passing in you are passing in a buffer to the stream, but you still are responsible for cleaning it up when the stream is done. If we were to look at this in a different way I believe Levi mentioned it last week. In C++, for example, it's not uncommon to have specifically an allocation template pattern, whereas you pass in an allocator and a deallocator, and the ownership stays entirely outside of special scenarios with the object you're passing the allocator into. And so therefore you can do your pooling, you can decide, this could just be a call into malloc if you wanted to, but ultimately the stream, when it's done, has a way to clean up that resource, whether that's returning it to the pool, freeing it, or just being a no-op. That way you can reuse it yourself however you want. And so it's likely something that I think we want to talk with Jan and Meoni and come up with how do we want to look at more intelligent custom resource management across .NET, and come up with a design pattern that we would be able to follow everywhere where it's applicable.
Yeah, so basically a memory allocator of T then.
Or even an I allocator, and then you would say I take a T where T is an I allocator, and that then that you say I want to allocate these elements, and then it gives you a buffer that's big enough to hold all of that, and then when you're done with it, you say free, but then the object that did the allocation is responsible for saying when it's done. That way you don't have the issue outside of super edge scenarios of a user going, oh, I'm going to return this to the array pool while this stream still has access to it.
It sounds like you're describing the memory pool class.
I mean, sort of, but I think the idea is to have something that is kind of uniform between managed and native, right?
Yeah, I mean, the memory pool class can return native memory.
Yeah,
I guess the only weird thing is the method is called rent rather than allocate,
which would be fine.
Sure.
Right, but just like with array pool, there's a lot of potential issues with it today, and Jan and Meoni are already looking into this area for array pool, and I would want their sign off saying that yes, memory pool is what we want to do or what we will continue with in the future, because it's the right thing.
No, I mean, that's fair.
Yep.
No, I mean, it's just a question of like how far off are we, right? Like, I mean, it's always said when you refuse an API and say that's invent this generic mechanism that we don't even know what it is like, but it seems like we already have ways to do it. It's just a question of like what's the pattern we want to promote and what do we feel warm and fuzzy about. I think Levi, like, what are your thoughts? Because last time you were the ones pushing back on this proposal.
So Tanner's right there. We have fielded requests to add pooling to other types in the framework. The ones that stand out to me are memory stream, list of T, and string builder. People ask all the time for us to add pooling support to those. If we had some common mechanism where we could add pooling support to everything, including file stream, via a common pattern, we would absolutely want to do that rather than create something that's one-off. That said, if we think that this is a special case and we really are unlikely to get to the other stuff, then that would certainly bump up the need to do a specialized API for this type.
Yeah, I can agree there. If we talk to Jan and Meoni and they say this is like a .NET 8 feature, then I think that it'd be fine if we say like maybe array pooling is good enough for this for today, or maybe this is going to be an okay one-off. If they say that we're looking at having this fixed for .NET 6 or for .NET 7, then I think maybe we just want to hold off.
Yeah, I mean, the question is like the alternative design that Adam is proposing here, where basically file stream would manage its own buffers. The only thing you get to say is basically please pool them and please use this buffer size. do we think that this addresses the concerns we had from last time?
I wouldn't do pool buffer on file options. That seems like the wrong place to put it. If we wanted the ability to specify your own buffer, I would do what was listed earlier and just take it as a parameter. If we're nervous about the fact that this might not be a viable long-term feature, I mean, didn't we just approve a preview feature mechanism?
Yeah, we did, but like so the problem of this preview feature is that it's new, right? And so like we're still kind of working through what that means when you turn it on and like what the enforcement level actually ends up being. So I'm kind of hesitant to use it for, general purpose library functionality at this point. But I mean, that's clearly the intent, right? So that we eventually will be able to do these things. But I mean, to me, it's also kind of a little bit of a cop out, because if you put experimental on something, like what exactly are you looking for in terms of feedback to make a decision, right? Because if it's robustness, then I don't think you get that via that mechanism anyway, right? You would have to like monitor Watson reports for a year to figure out what's going on, but that might be hard, right? If it's more like, okay, we're unsure about the shape of the API, whether people can actually do something useful with it, that's probably fair to say we use preview APIs for that. But I mean, at this point, it seems like the 4 people that really want this API, they would be able to put it to use, right? So it's...
What would stop them from using a preview feature if they really want it?
No, I'm saying, like, to me, it's a bit of a cop-out in the sense that just because we don't like an API, marking it as preview is not necessarily the right way of doing it. The question is for us, what feedback are we waiting for to remove the preview marker, right? That's kind of the thing, right? So
I wouldn't say we don't like it. I would say like we don't think that this is a final shape, because we think that this is probably we think that this is probably an early shape of something that should be more generalized, is how I would see it.
I see. So we are basically saying if we get this Mahoney yarn feature, then maybe if you want to yank these things off and do the other thing.
I mean, if the only concern really is that every file stream always also creates an array, and you want to use the array pool, but people aren't good at disposing things, you could always add cheat and add a field on the safe file handle that you have open, which holds the array that you've rented, and when that safe file handle release handle is called, then you return it. Like, you can bury it in an already finalizable object just to know that the lifetime's expired. It doesn't have to be public API, and you would avoid the pool exhaustion, which actually isn't terrible. It's just less than ideal. So unless there's actually a scenario where somebody really wants to say use this exact buffer, I think you can bury this in implementation details pending maybe we want to allow custom allocators as a generalized feature.
I mean, you could also have rent and return virtual methods on file stream too.
Sure, but they have the same use of the free problems, right? If somebody doesn't call them, then...
Yeah, the problem is FileStream doesn't know when it's done. It doesn't know when it can return the buffer to the pool.
When it's disposed of, presumably, but yeah.
Right, and so that would be easy to wire up right now, which is it uses arraypool.shared.rent, and then when it's disposed, it releases, but if it's not disposed, then it's arraypool stealing, which not great, but not terrible. And if you're concerned about the stealing, then you bury it in the file stream, or the
You'd
the
have
file
to have interlocked calls everywhere, but yeah.
Yeah. One more problem with disposing is that at the dispose time, we are not sure whether there aren't any async operations still in flight, because in theory, somebody could start an async read and just dispose file stream without waiting. And to be honest with you, the original poster asked for the possibility to provide unmanaged memory. However, I believe that this is rather a niche scenario, a very high performance scenario. And from the profiling that I have been doing in the file stream rewrite, the allocation of the buffer itself was never the biggest perf problem. And we have solved all other big problems. And this is, this one compared to others is tiny. And I just wanted to have to be able to say zero allocation now, like we have to get rid of all of them. So I'm completely fine with, taking Tanner's recommendation and talking to Jan and Maoni and coming up with some more generic approach, like maybe something that gives us a factory of I memory owner. So we allocate the memory on our own, we dispose it when we know we can.
Yeah, I mean the big problem, Maoni's involvement means we're tying it into the GC, but the big problem with that is, again, FileStream doesn't know when it's done with a thing. We have this thing that tracks when things have gone out of, referential integrity. I don't know, something, and that's the GC. Like, we have a system for that. It's called garbage collection. But
yes. Another problem is that most of our users don't know that it's possible to disable the buffering. It's quite magical because you need to set the buffer size to 1. And I have received a lot of feedback on Twitter about this particular problem with the array allocation, and most of the people were not aware of the fact that it's possible to disable it. We are planning to mention that in the preview for blog post and also release a set of recommendations for best practices for file I/O performance. So
sorry, if 1 means disable buffering, what does 0 mean?
Do whatever you want.
Choose a size for it.
So no, so far FileStream was throwing for 0 or negative values for buffer size.
No way.
Yeah.
Maybe we should just make 0 do what people think it does, and then.
Yeah. That's the other very confusing thing about that. So maybe we could agree that we can add back buffer size to FileStream options, because last time we haven't agreed on how we should be dealing with buffering with FileStream option flag back. So maybe we just add buffer size and allow for 0 to disable the buffering.
I mean, that seems reasonable to me. I think buffer size seems not problematic, right? Like what is problematic is if you can specify the buffer and then decide to use it in opportune moments, right?
Yeah, so now that you're creating the option bag, you do have a complication of, do you want to say 0 means do the default, or do you want to say that 0 means it's disabled and you just, in the constructor, default it to, it is a class, so you can do that. So you have to decide how you want to handle that state.
Here I think that we could default it to 4K, and in the XML summary doc mention that 0 means disable it.
Fair enough.
Yeah, that seems reasonable to me. And then we would not do the file options, right? We would only do the file stream options, right?
Yes.
In general, like, even if you wanted to do pooling, I would still probably put it on file stream options, not file options. But maybe that's just me. Because I think file options is the super advanced, like, drill in kind of thing. Maybe that's where pooling should be, but it seems to me if you can specify buffer size, whether the buffer is pooled or not, it seems kind of like a setting that you want kind of next to it, not buried in some other struct or first flags based unit.
That's fair point. I have obsession for sizes of the objects, so that's why I wanted to extend existing enumeration.
I see, because bits are free. I get it. Yeah. In this case, it's like, yeah, if you have to specify buffer size, yeah, it seems like I would put it there.
Okay.
I don't know, like, if we decide the options thing, right now the design is such that you can easily, trivially pool those, right? Because it's just like, it's your shared options you'd set up once and never share, never change again. So I generally don't care about these options types in terms of allocations, because, unless they hold on to per use state, which they shouldn't arguably, they are basically 0 cost.
Personally, I would prefer it to be a struct, but I know that it comes with some usability problems, and modifying a copy somewhere and not seeing the end
Yeah,
result.
I mean, the problem with structs is really is like, every time we went clever with structs, it backfires, right? Like it's just for mainline APIs, it's not great. I mean, in the areas where we have used it, it's still, we receive a lot of feedback that people are confused why their code doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And then we spend some cycles trying to figure out why it doesn't work, and it turns out, yeah, you're not using the struct correctly, right? It's just not. Like we have talked about analyzers for that as well, but they're also very, very hard to get right because the compiler makes defensive copies left and right. And so you have to be very, very careful about how that is being done. And there was some conversation about exposing was an API, so you could in principle provide an analyzer that does that. But so far that doesn't exist. So you would have to kind of replicate the compiler logic, which, is flaky.
All right. So
Alrighty, so then
I think I captured it with this.
seems reasonable.
Yes.
All right. So we're approving adding the buffer
Who's
size.
on the hook?
And
Yeah, who's on the hook to have the conversation with Maroni? Like, Tana, are you taking point on that?
I haven't started the conversation with Mal yet, but I'm going to reach out to her.
Okay, cool. So yeah, as long as somebody is doing it.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of the fact that somebody's currently working on, the big picture of pulling memory.
Neither was I, but since Tana mentioned it, I wanted to make sure that he can volunteer himself if he wants.
The default on that
All
buffer
right.
size is it defaults to 4096, right? So the point being, it doesn't need to be nullable. It's got a default value. You change it to 0, it
Yeah.
throws, etc.
I think he said he was willing to let 0 be buffering is off.
Disabled. Yeah.
Yes,
So
buffering
it's
is
going to be different than if I use the file stream constructor that takes a buffer size. It's going to act different.
So Eric, your question is whether we should set the default value for K in explicit way here. So the default behavior is the same. Buffering is enabled with a 4K buffer.
Yeah, I kind of have two questions. One is how does the default of this buffer size work? And then two is, does this buffer size work the same way as the file stream constructor that takes an int buffer size?
Yeah, so I think that we should set it to 4K in explicit way. And the difference with FileStream constructor will be that 0 will be accepted as a way of disabling the buffering. Because currently the FileStream constructors throw for 0 and negative values, treat 1 as buffering disabled and everything bigger than 1 as actual buffer size, which is
And
quite
so setting
complex.
this to 0 or 1 will disable buffering?
Yes.
I mean, we should consider changing the constructor in FileStream and just have the same behavior there. Like, not throwing is not a breaking change.
Oh, I don't have a lot of experience in changing things like that, so I would be happy to do it.
Yeah, you can certainly turn an argument exception into working code.
Yes, I know how to do it.
Well, I mean, like that's in our breaking changes. That's an acceptable change.
Okay. Yeah, nobody should be relying on that. So, can you put this?
Gonna, but like we don't care.
Jeremy, could you put this in the your comment description that we can remove this, or it's not part of the proposal, so it's
Yeah, it's just a bug fix.
okay.
All right.
Sorry to be pedantic, just one more. It defaults to 4K. Right?
In the constructor, because it's a class.
So if I don't ever set this, I get buffering by default.
Yes.
Okay, just making sure I understand.
All right. Consider making try get enumerated count an interface method with a default implementation. 52775. It touches IEnumerable if T rejected.
Eric, are you Eric T? Are you on the call?
Yeah,
Okay,
I'm
great.
actually wondering, is Andy in the call? Okay, some context on this issue. I actually only saw it this morning, but I had this discussion about this very proposal with Andy and Steve Tobe a few weeks ago. And my conclusion and Steven's conclusion was that this would create issues like diamond issues with interfaces that provide implementations for that method. So I wouldn't personally support this. Yeah, I guess I should have removed the ready for review label, but I only just saw it. So I'm also wondering if Andy might have, given that we had this conversation in the past, I'm wondering if he made some new findings that might invalidate the point about diamond problems being an issue with this particular method. But the main example that basically makes this impractical, if you scroll down, is you would need to provide implementations for I collection of T and I read-only collection of T, and you have many classes that implement both interfaces. So immediately you would end up breaking these classes because of ambiguity.
Yeah, I mean, I think right now our general stance is I don't know that anybody who's in this meeting right now has used DIMs. And if they have used DIMs, I don't know they've used them in a library they've published and that they've then versioned. So one of the big things right now is we have no idea what the consequences of DIMs are with versioning code. And our position is we're not willing to do it on any of the super critical interfaces like IEnumerable until we've learned in a more remote area. But this one is specifically bad because it is exactly setting up for the diamond problem, so it will probably never get approved.
We have Andy joining us now. We managed to get him in.
Yep.
Hey.
So you can't touch IEnumerable, and we hate diamonds. Why do you think this works? Yeah. So what really the question for you is, why are you not concerned of this introducing diamonds?
Me.
Yes, you, Andy. The proposer.
In the initial edition, where would the diamond come from?
So it was pointed out in the comments on the issue that iRead-only list and iList would probably both want to provide implementations for the base member, which means now any type that's both iList and iRead-only list has a diamond conflict because they both have a count.
So that would be a statement about the implementations themselves. That is not a statement about this method.
Fair. I mean, I guess, but then that would be saying that we then never overwrite it in the interface hierarchies and make all the types have to go back and do it. Like, we can't use the interfaces to help out because we have separated read-only or iRead-only list and iList. Like, we can never unify them, which means we can never unify an implementation for this particular member other than the I can enumerate myself and count. Or sorry, other than I can return 0/false.
Is it true that you can never add an additional interface base to both of them?
So the one thing we know about DIMs is never use DIMs to provide a base interface method implementation. But this is a thing that we would exactly want to do that on.
No, that's not what I mean. Like introducing a new interface that is a base of both iRead-only list and iList.
Is the compiler going to allow or does the compiler understand and the runtime understand you explicitly implemented a thing that moved to a base interface declaration? I don't think so.
It wouldn't be moving it, right? If we do it now, it wouldn't be moving it. The point being that we have to figure out like what we would want to introduce. So here's the thing. I'm fine if the resolution here is we tried our best and we couldn't make it work, but I didn't see that. I would like to see a justification of why we can't do this, because I looked all over the repo and I cannot find one.
Well, the short one
I
is
see,
we're
like,
afraid of
vague,
dims.
like there's a diamond problem. I'd like to see, here's the actual diamond problem. Here are all the possible solutions that we considered, and none of them work because here. Why?
I don't understand why this has to be like a 6.0 or never. Like, why couldn't we do this in 7 or 8?
I think that once you introduce things, then yeah, there are problems. There might be diamond problems that would not have occurred before.
But what would you introduce? I mean, we would not introduce a new member without providing a default implementation, right?
Right.
Clearly. So, like, I mean, like, if we don't do the method in 6, we could do the method in 7, right?
I think the concern would be people adding implementations for it and then creating their own diamond problems. It wouldn't be a new framework problem. It would be like customers breaking themselves.
I'm still not following. What does not doing it in 6 mean? Like, you're providing a different interface, or what is the? Because
I believe the motivation
interface
is
already shipped, right?
Different method.
If I understand Andy's motivation, it's replacing the try get non-enumerated count extension method that is currently just added in link with this thing.
I see. So the try get enumerated extension method is new in 6, and so you're basically saying instead of doing that, we should do this one here instead.
Yeah. Now, if we keep the extension method for visibility, then it maybe doesn't matter, because the answer is we change the implementation. But then we should really decide what the implementation is. So, for example, the current implementation, I went and it checks to see, like, dynamically type checks to see whether or not the target is I collection. If we only introduce this for I enumerable of T, that makes no sense. Like, if we wanted to make the implementation check for the default interface method, or invoke the default interface method, well, it wouldn't exist on I enumerable non-generic, or we put it on I enumerable non-generic, but that's like a decision that we probably have to make now. The whole dynamically type checking for a non-generic version inside the implementation for I enumerable of T is already a little bit like, pointing out the implementation problems for this made me think that's a little sketchy anyway. It feels like there's bigger questions that were not resolved.
Yeah, so to answer your first question, I think the problem with the diamond, so last time we looked into this was the question of, can we make the mutable interfaces extend the read-only ones so that we don't have this dichotomy in our class hierarchy? And the reason we couldn't do it when we introduced them was because of explicit interface implementations, right? Because the base methods would have different identities from the derived ones. And so basically, we thought that maybe we can use explicit interface members, default interface members to map them, so that when you basically extend I collection, you don't have to redefine, I read only collection members, because that's already done by I collection. And it's kind of doing what Jeremy suggested, right? Basically, now you have a derived interface defining default members for its bases. And that works so long you don't have a hierarchy with a diamond anywhere. But the problem is with our collection interfaces, like dictionaries, for example, they implement frequently multiple different generics, and then they both go back to the same ancestor. And so you have like 2 different versions of those guys. And
I would like you to explain this in documented text form somewhere, because
that's fair.
It's nowhere, and I keep asking about like what the plans are in the future, and right now it's like you or somebody else gives me a variant of somewhat the same thing every time, and I'm like, please just show it to me, and then we can resolve this for good.
I mean, So I'll let Emo write something, but I can say
I'm not convinced that introducing a new base is not workable. So like that's the other thing. Like I'm not actually convinced you're right.
Yeah, I mean that's fair. I mean I'm not convinced either. It's like last time we looked into this, we spent significant time and then gave up. Like, I mean, because it wasn't the biggest problem at the time either, right? So, but basically, it is the concern is basically what happens when we do that, right? So yeah, I can try to write up what we found back then, and then we can walk the list and convince ourselves that maybe it is a safe change. I'm skeptical, but
yeah. I mean, right now the cynical interpretation, which is probably true, is we're in a catch-22 of we won't use dims because we've never used dims, and we definitely won't use dims on IEnumerable because we've never used dims, and so we don't understand what the breaking changes are. The only thing we know is anytime anybody has come up with them, they want to provide one interface providing an implementation for a base member, and that's when we start getting set up for runtime diamonds, and that's when we, like, David Wrighton said something very sagely in the meeting and nodded authoritatively, and we all looked at David and nodded and got up and left the room and decided we can't do any of this. And that was in, back when we had offices, so like 3 years ago.
Yeah, we should write that up. Like, you're not going to convince me otherwise.
No. So I'm just like, that's where it all came from, is when DIMs were first being proposed, we went, wow, we can't figure out how to use any of these things, so we can't figure out what any of the rules are. Let's go to a different meeting. And
so I distinctly remember some of those conversations, and they were for all of the discussions at that time that I was a part of were for existing members. They were not for new members. So I think that there needs to be another discussion specifically for adding new members. And then if you want to be conservative about it, just in general, for like all DIM stuff, and if you want to be conservative about IEnumeral in particular, then I think you should have a write-up of why it's not possible for any variant of IEnumerable before adding something new to IEnumerable. Like, that's the super conservative approach. If you really want to be careful about IEnumerable, then it would be to say, okay, when we think about adding new things to IEnumerable that would be appropriate as default interface methods, we should figure out what the problems are with default interface methods on IEnumerable first and write them all down.
It's fair.
I mean, so far, like what you said is actually not true. Like, we don't have a massive desire to add a ton of methods to IEnumerable, right? So like usually we solve problems when we have them. And so we went 3 years without having to do that. So that's why we never ended up writing it up, right?
Sure, I'm not arguing that, but I'm arguing right now you want to add something to IEnumerable, so that still...
No, I mean, depends what you mean by adding to it. I mean, we have added extension methods in the past, right?
Exactly
like, we understand them very well.
Right,
Yeah.
That's exactly what I mean. That adding an extension method when there's a very clear reason why, if default interface methods works, you would not want to add an extension method. That's why having the write-up is valuable.
But by the way, just for some historical interest, like we did bring to API review a year, maybe 2 years ago, default interface implementations on IEnumerable of T, such that they would implement the non-generic IEnumerable interface for you. Like, they would forward calls to move next, current, dispose with no up, and so on. And this group at the time said, wow, that's really valuable, but we don't think we can do it. For the same reason, the group didn't know what would break if we were to do that. So this has come up before, even on IEnumerable of T.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the contra positive, I guess, to that is we don't know why it would work, and we have a lot of inklings of reasons why it couldn't, and that's prevented forward progress.
Then it should be marked an open question, and we should put it in an issue, and we should look at it before adding things that might benefit.
But yeah, I feel like the problem always
like
ends up being dictionary of to key to value. Like, that any time that we've ever thought of doing anything, it's always on IEnumerable. We end up at dictionary of to key to value, and it ends up creating a conflict and then just showing where all the conflicts are going to come out of.
But there are other things that you probably can't. So I think if you wrote it up, then you would come up with things that were 100% safe. Like, for example, providing a default implementation of reset.
Since literally no one's ever implemented it. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, I
There's
just
no
put a
reason not
link
to do
in
it.
chat.
There's no potential diamond problem because you're not going to implement it differently for anybody.
I mean, we can certainly do the write-up. I think I have no objections to that. It's just that, you know, the bar is usually the other way around, right? It's not like we have to provide a write-up, but we're not doing things. It's the other way around because the risks are higher than the rewards usually, right? So, for example, the thing that Levi suggested was use for people that have to actually manually implement IEnumerable, which is not a very common scenario, right? Most of the people that implement IEnumerables do this by writing iterators, or they just compose existing collections and forward calls, right? So the concern is like, yeah, we're adding a feature that benefits a few advanced users, but then, you know, accidentally we ended up breaking somebody in VB with some combination of language features, right? And so that's kind of we're still at the moment where like the benefits we have seen, or the proposed benefits, were all minor. None of them were substantial, right? That's kind of the problem.
The benefits here are pretty clear. I wrote it up. But the point is, if you're not going to do this, who is?
I'm
not saying we're not going to do it. I'm just saying, you know, the write-up is not cheap, right?
Yeah, that's the catch-22.
It's not. Like spending time on this is also not
it
free.
Should have been. Okay, you know what? That's not true. It should have been cheap, and the reason was because you should have done this in a documented way. If you have a big conversation with David Wright and where you decide a new rule for the framework for IEnumerable, what if half of you got hit by a bus and we have to figure out what to do about IEnumerable now? Like, there's no record of this, and somebody just goes and adds it, and then it breaks. Like, write down the decision if you want to make that the decision that you use for these kinds of discussions in the future.
I'm confused by what you mean by the decision. So basically, every time something changes,
the
like every time there's a new language feature or there's a new title.
I'm gonna jump in here a little bit, folks. We are like way off in the weeds in terms of some process. I think there's a good discussion to be worked out in terms of what level of documentation we need to have around this problem space. I think for the moment, this particular issue is not moving forward today. Should we move on to the next item on the agenda?
That's fine.
Yeah, but we should still close on what the next steps are, right? So like I think like
so
just sitting on the issue is also not helping, right?
Right. So it sounds like the result of this is we're not going to do this because we have a rule about adding default interface methods to IEnumerable, but that rule isn't written down anywhere. So the action item needs to be somebody needs to go write down the rule. And why?
Yeah. I mean, right now the rule is because we're scared. Or the why is because we're scared.
That's not a very good reason. I mean, you could be scared of anything. Write a justification. I can be scared. I'm scared of the letter E. We shouldn't add any methods with the letter E.
Cool. So I will say that if you go to issue 29513, Jeremy did add a lengthy comment to the bottom of that detailing what he believes the problem is. We should probably confirm whether or not that problem is real.
Right.
Wow, that guy wrote a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Don't you have a section in the API design guidelines somewhere recently that you added as well on DIBs?
So FDG3 has an annotation from me that says the only rule we understand so far is never provide an implementation of a base method, because that creates diamonds. But that otherwise we don't have enough experience to know what the actual rule should be. And that continues to be true. Because every time we've come up with a place where we feel that we're willing to start experimenting, they go, oh, we're net standard 2.0 because we care about .NET Framework, so we can't use DIMs. And then we go back to we have zero experience with DIMs.
Pretty much.
I think Andy's point is right, though. I think there's some onus on the forum here to get some more documentation in place on this particular issue and look at the right way to put it into our design guidelines.
Yeah, it sounds like the next step honestly is for someone to actually like take the stuff that Jeremy wrote and try it out and make sure that it's correct. Because it's a thought experiment so far, right? Like we should kick the wheels on it.
I think so, because I don't think I've ever actually written a dim. I think I was just trying to articulate what we found out in that meeting.
Yeah, we had several. Like, I think the other person who was involved was Mihal. Like, I don't think it was Brighton, actually.
Fair enough. It's a long time ago. I can barely remember yesterday. With accuracy.
Do we need to test it on all runtimes? Like mono AOT, core RT?
Presumably all supported runtimes, yeah.
Well, then core RT wouldn't fit the bill.
Not yet. Someday, maybe.
Well, it explicitly doesn't support default interface implementation, so I can go right there and just tell you it doesn't work.
Okay.
It's also, I think you need native AOT. Core RT is dead.
Yeah, whatever we're calling it now. But also WASM AOT, right? Mono WASM AOT.
Yeah, and I have no idea whether or not it supports default interface implementation. Like, it's not a requirement for all runtimes to support the feature, but it probably matters depending upon what you want to do.
It matters if we're going to introduce an API that you can only call.
Yeah, but ASP.NET is using default interface implementation, so you know you're gonna. It's a question of how serious you're going to be about it.
ASP.NET has different targets than we do.
I agree. That's why I'm saying, like, it's a question of exactly what requirements you have.
I mean, moving forward, all runtimes must support default interface methods effectively.
If you support .NET 6 or .NET
Standard 2.1.
Sure. Yeah.
So, which basically means it's effectively everything we're building now.
Yep. Yeah, actually,
it's just that
it's in the runtime feature. Like, the runtime feature flag is enabled. Like, that's in the framework. It says every runtime, by implementing the feature, the API set, explicitly says I support default interface implementations. If it does not implement that feature set, then it should not implement that framework.
Yeah, I think the question is also languages, right? That this is the whole, like, do we care about CLI or whatever? Sorry, CLS. But, like, we don't really care about CLS compliance as the mechanism, but we do care that our framework is consumable by other languages, right? So the problem then becomes is, like, what do VB and F# do as well, right? It's not just what does the runtime do. But yeah.
Yep. Don't forget COBOL.NET.
That one.
Yeah, so kick this one for now, but we'll come back to it.
All right. So for those who don't feel like reading a tiny screen, what I've put in the notes, we currently have apprehension about adding dims at this level. For this particular method, we're concerned that the obvious solution is to re-implement the methods an iCollection of T and iReadOnly collection of T, which now provides multiple non-unified implementations to concrete types. That would manifest as a runtime breaking change for any type that already implements those two interfaces. But we agree we could use some better concrete guidelines here going forward.
Sounds good to me.
All right.
Could use some better concrete guidelines, or we're going to have some better.
I don't know that we can agree that we're going to have better guidelines. We agree that we want better guidelines, but coming up with them is hard.
Okay, so I do want to say, like, please investigate introducing a new base interface and implementing it there. That's a potential alternative, and I don't think that was discussed.
Introducing a new interface.
Yeah, a new countable maybe countable IEnumerable, implementing it all through, and then that one is the one that has the implementation.
That would be iRead-only collection. So it's basically a question of whether we want iCollection to inherit from that and the other interfaces.
Well,
iRead-only collection is just IEnumerable T with account property.
It would be, it would have account property, and then it would also have this try maybe get count or whatever.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. I think the suggestion was to have one interface with just this try method on it, and have
I don't think that would
read-only collection and collection inherit that interface.
I don't think
I think a try method only makes sense in the base IEnumerable.
You have to have count, right? Because the new interface has to have the default implementation, and we want the default implementation to be count. So you would end up with like a new interface that is unified across. Like it really is like a duplication of read-only collection. You know.
Yeah, which is then any type that has overridden all those things explicitly implemented count because they have a thing called length that they think's a better public name. Then those would now not provide a count implementation, so they would fail to compile or fail to.
I don't think that's
load.
true. I think that the count would be the implementation. It would be a new method, right? Like read-only collections count is a new thing.
Oh, you would make count a method, not a property.
Or something like that, right? Like you can. There are a variety of different mechanisms you can do. You can just make a different name or whatever, and then you default implement that, and then so basically, you know what? Just we should go through and make sure we can't figure it out some other way.
Fair enough.
If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But like, let's do it.
Fair enough. But yes, this is not the right forum. But I agree we should show why it can't be done. Just not while live streaming.
Sounds good. All right, I gotta run. Thanks.
That's good. All right. So then, this one we wanted to skip, right, Steve? Or do you want to? No, the one you said you wanted to do last, right?
We're now down to things that people are saying we can defer. So it's either we just skip these and go straight to older issues, or we look at them because they're now the oldest reds.
Yeah, let's just because given that we have the people in the room, I would start with them. So I guess then trimmability first, yeah.
Yeah. All right. So trimmability for JSON value 52773.
Hopefully this one is fast. Non-controversial. Eric Earhart logged an issue that's linked, and basically the issue is that if you call this create method, it may invoke the serializer later when you call to JSON string, and because they can call the serializer, which is not trim safe, we need to add an attribute. We haven't done that yet, but we need to add an attribute to the create method, which causes other kinds of issues, especially since the JSON node base class implements toString, and it's a virtual method, of course, on object, so it causes all kinds of, in theory, explosions of having to put that attribute everywhere. So the idea is to split up the create into two, a safe create and an unsafe create. And in order to do this without completely kind of changing the programming model, a bunch of overloads were added to create for the supported types, and these are the safe ones. And then a new method called create from serializable value was added, which is the unsafe.
So my first question is, like you have a bunch of overloads that take nullable types like nullable bool, nullable byte, and so on, but the implementation just returns null. Like why not just force the caller to pass a non-nullable value to these methods?
I guess the pattern mirrors what we had for the operators, which has both. Implicit and explicit cast operators or conversion operators.
I mean, once we have like 5 overloads, I don't know that it hurts things to have the nullable versions as well.
I was just trying to figure out like if somebody would be surprised that I pass like a nullable, I pass null to the bool question mark method, and instead of returning a JSON value that represents null, it just returns null. Like that just seemed odd to me.
So that is what happens today, right? I mean, null is, JSON value can be null. A nullable of bool will return a null JSON value.
Okay.
All right. Does anybody have opinions on the name create from serializable value? Of some very long attribute T?
Normally, this would be one of 3 different types. Most likely, it would be a custom type that they have, like if they have their own custom data type for money, for example. Otherwise, it could be any serializable type, including an anonymous type, or a POCO, or a collection, even if that happens to be handy, if you happen to have one already. As long as it's serializable, meaning that we can call the serializer later when you call toJSON string, it'll work. So that was the intent of the name of from serializable value anyway.
Yeah, I mean,
could it just be non-primitive? Create from non-primitive value, or?
Well, if you have a custom data type that's money, that's still a primitive.
Is it though?
I mean,
well, it's a struct, and it's just not shipped by us. I mean, if you have your own date type, I mean, is that a primitive? I mean, it's going to be a struct.
I mean, is date only a primitive?
Non-primitive, maybe.
I'm just saying, like, once we have datetime offset, datetime, and GUID in here, like, it's not like everything that's in here is primitives, and this is the non-primitives. Plus, we have the create of if you give it the serializer state, then you can call the simple name, and it's only when you call the one that it needs to make it up on the fly that you have to call the long name. So.
I mean, the problem with primitives is that it's not like there's this one definition of a primitive, right? I mean, you can either say, is this, intrinsic in IL, does it have a language keyword, right? There's multiple dimensions to that, and they don't all agree on what is truly a primitive type, right? But I think there's a customer expectation for certain types, right? So, like, I don't know, datetime, not a primitive, but based on how most people use it, sort of is a primitive, right?
Wouldn't most people just call create anyway, passing in their serializable type? Like, if I'm literally just typing on a keyboard, I'm going to see a bunch of overloads of create. I'm also going to see that I can just pass any arbitrary value to create. So why would I ever call create from serializable value?
Well, you can only call this one if you use the source generator and get the JSON type info object ahead of time.
Oh, because yes, it requires that. Okay.
Yeah, so actually this particular method isn't directly related to the main issue. It was just like, okay, trimmability, the JSON type info was added after JSON node. So or at the same time. So we couldn't add this at the same time. But since it's related to trimmability, it was included here.
So I'm still not entirely sure, like, is the proposal to remove the generic one and explode them into these overloads, or is the proposal that they're both there?
Okay, so the one that's in red, across that one, basically is replaced by the create from serializable value plus the explosions below. The very first create that takes JSON type info is really unrelated to the main issue. It's just yet another way to safely create an object, safely trimmable at least. So if you happen to be using source gen and you have the JSON type info, you can call that creative T and pass in, your POCO, for example, and that's going to be trim safe.
I see. So the idea is that create from serializable value is basically for non-primitives where we just run through the normal serialization behavior. That's why we need public constructors and public fields and properties, basically. And everything else is basically atomically handled or intrinsically handled by the serializer, and that's why we don't want to require any of those things.
Yeah, we can reference an existing converter for those.
I see.
And for the programming model, for 95%, users won't notice this, right? Because if they're calling create, I mean, if they happen to use in the preview 4 bits at least, if they're calling creative T that's in red, they just, that it'll still, when they recompile, it'll just compile, assuming they're using a primitive type or, one of these known types.
I was about to say, if they use their own struct, they would have to change the call side from create to create from serializable value, right?
Yep.
Is there a way that the trimmer could be smarter with the existing generic method? Is that a silly question?
It's not a silly question, but there's no easy way to do it in 6. Like I literally just had a meeting an hour ago with the trimmer team and follow up. Exact problem.
I see.
We have some ideas of a solution, but none of them are for 6.
Yeah. I mean, what saddens me a bit is that it's kind of this explosion of methods, right? Do we only need to do this for the entry points, or is there a chance that this is the typical viral problem, and then we have to add corresponding methods elsewhere?
I mean, if you have a new value you want to assign to a JSON value of node, there's really only 2 ways to do it. You either call one of these create methods, or you use one of the operators, explicit operator, cast operators. So, and for the most part, since there's inference on these create methods, you don't have to. When the IntelliSense is going to be, kind of big, I guess, when it pops up, but it's not going to.
No, I don't care about that. I think in the IntelliSense it's fine. I mean, the whole job is overloads. As I'm talking through it, the user quickly gets the idea, I can pass in any type I want. But it's more the amount of methods we need to add, right? Like, if this is the only place, it's fine. But like, if you have to do this in 6 more places, that would start to suck, right?
No, we don't. But all these create methods have their mirror counterpart for the implicit and explicit cast operators. Or actually, for this case, it would be explicit cast operators, where you're trying to create. Implicit. And if you scroll down a little bit more, just to close on it, there was some implicit operators that were missing, and explicit operators that were missing for JSON Element. We don't have to add this, but since we covered all of the other values above, except for these, JSON Element, I think it makes sense to round out the parity between create and the operators.
And why do we need both nullable and non-nullable?
We in theory we don't. I mean, it just makes it a little bit easier, depending on your variable type. I mean, if you have a and JSON is special. I have a little comment on there.
Because you return nullable from the nullable and non-nullable from the non-nullable.
Yeah.
I see. Yeah, I was under the impression that you could just take you could only accept a nullable, and then the user has implicit conversions, but then they also get a nullable back.
But isn't JSON node a class? So these are the same operator.
It just can be null.
Well, you can't do this. They're the same method. If JSON node is a class, JSON node question mark and JSON node are the exact same thing. You can't overload based on nullable annotations.
It's not okay, but it's not nullable of T, right?
Right, which mean so if you went to add both of these, you would get a compile error that you've defined the same method twice.
Interestingly, you don't, but
because this is the one case that the return value actually also corresponds. So it's if it wants a destination nullable JSON element, then now this becomes a candidate, and it says it takes a nullable input.
But it doesn't matter, right? In IL, you can overload based on return type, but you can only do that when they're different types. But they're both JSON elements; they're just different attributed.
Well, but
so I don't know how.
But operators obviously have to let you have. Oh no, they don't obviously have to let you return. But JSON element is nullable, so this is 2 different operations. This is if you are turning it into a nullable JSON element, then this is your input signature, and if you're turning it into a non-nullable
so JSON element is a struct. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, JSON element is a struct. JSON node is a class.
Yeah, for example,
that's
this
why you
string
have to,
one.
oh, I see. Okay.
If this was returning a string, this operator doesn't exist 4 times. It only exists twice.
So, yeah, personally, I mean, I know that there are people who care about the 150 bytes it takes to just declare this method as existing. It's below my caring bar. So I have no problem with the top part. I'm not totally sold on create from serializable value, but don't have a better name. And we kind of want people to not call it if they care about trimming. So having not a great name is fine. So I personally am like, whatever, sign off on this.
So why would I? Yeah, that's it. But that's a good question. Why would I ever call create from serializable value? Isn't the whole point that everything is trimmable and I avoid dynamic fallbacks?
Ignoring trimmability, I mean, you'd want to call create from serializable value when you have an anonymous type, when you have your own custom data type, or when you have a poke word collection, and you want to be able to assign that to a JSON value and serialize it. Otherwise, if you're cared about trimmability, you would pass in the JSON type info above, and you wouldn't call create from serializable value. Just call it create JSON type info if you have it.
Oh, sorry. No, it makes sense now. For some reason, I thought we looked at APIs from the source generator, but we look at the DOM APIs. Never mind.
Yeah. The JSON type info was a type added for the source generator, but this is just taking advantage of it.
I mean, clearly I want to be able to use the DOM without using a source generator, right? So clearly I need a way to do that.
Right.
But
and that's this guy.
Yeah, it's a bit unfortunate that. So, and we can't overload because, I mean, we should be able to overload between them, right?
Yeah, scroll to the right there, just to be clear on the create from serializable value. That's what you're referring to, right? Can you overload on that?
Yeah, because I mean, like realistically, what happens is now when I pass in my POCO and I'm not trimming, I don't care, right? Everything will just work. If I enable trimming, now I get linker warnings because I have these restrictions, right? But that seems fine. I mean, like you get informed that you're doing something that may not work, right? But why would I have to call a method with a different name to do that?
I mean, we could go either way. It's just a question of, so I don't know, and maybe Eric, how much trimmability should matter to people in coming releases, because by having a different name, it means that we have a place in method group documentation that we can say, this method group is not trim friendly. If you can rewrite your code so that you can call create, then you're trim friendly. If we think it's kind of niche, then the attribute says enough.
I mean, you could imagine a case where, even if so for library authors, for example, maybe there's a mode where I can run basically run the linker warnings over my code without actually linking the library, right? So that if I'm library author, I know that my code is linker friendly, right? Which I assume is the intent when you put this I am linker friendly attribute on your libraries, right? That presumably that code would have run, right? Because I feel like, I don't know, like it seems weird to me that we say we put attributes on it and then we invest in the design time experience to give people squiggles and warnings. And then at the same time also say, oh, by the way, we have a naming convention throughout the framework where we name everything that's not linker friendly with a different name, which seems hard to do given that the vast majority of our system is not linker friendly, right? Depending on how you skin it. So
yeah, I mean,
it's basically you penalize the wrong people, I guess. Is my question.
Yeah, so I guess when I saw it, my first thought was really it's of why it made sense. And Steve, you can tell me if this was part of your thinking or if it's just a bonus reason. Is if you're calling the generic one, and you have the pre-generated thing from the source generator, you probably want to pass it. But if everything else that calls create is you pass the one thing and you're done, and this thing has 40 overloads, so you're not going to cycle through them, you don't see that there's a better thing that you could do by passing a second argument. So by this T is the one you want to call only if you have no better option. So having a different name makes you have to kind of think about it. But if we don't care about the mild perf hit, then whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on who you want to optimize for, right? I think I'm okay with different names. I'm just saying, imagine I'm a developer, as Philip said, I'm an old country developer, right? I'm just using, the DOM. I don't care about trimming. I'm not doing anything fancy. I just write a very simple app. Is that a method I would likely be calling? Probably not, right? Because it has the longest possible name, right? Versus the one that looks simple, that's the one that I'm probably not inclined to use, right?
We have other cases where like one overload is marked quote unquote unsafe and the other one is marked safe, right? Like JSON serializer .serialize. If you call the overload that doesn't take in the JSON type info, that's unsafe. So I mean, if you care, you'll get the linker warning that you're calling the JSON value .create. That's not safe, right? Like us naming it something different doesn't stop you from getting the linker warnings, or doesn't start you from getting the linker warnings, right? We're going to put the requires unreferenced code attribute on this overload no matter what we name it.
Yeah, we could just call it create. I think from the discussion that we had, Eric and I had earlier, we didn't really decide on a hard name, but it doesn't collide. I mean, it will pick the more specific overload down below, I believe. So if you have a primitive or a known type.
So I think I could and should still call it create. It's just adding the new overloads and then adding both the overload that takes in the JSON type info and then all the primitive overloads.
And then the dynamically accessed member attributes on the one we've already added.
Yeah, there's a long story there. Basically, they're going to go away.
I mean, the other alternative is you just name the old one create, and then all the new ones you create, you call differently, like create linker friendly. I mean, it's a bad name, but like something else that basically ties them all together, right?
But I mean, the 99% cases you want to call create with what I'm going to call a primitive value. Don't care what anybody else thinks it is. Like I want to call JSON value create string, int, double, whatever, right? And so I want that to just work. And the reason why this one's safe is because these primitive values are intrinsic to the serializer. Like there is nothing to be trimmed that won't work, right?
I see what you're saying. And I have to do nothing special about it. I don't have to pass in any sort of type info either because, they're primitives. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that's fair. So then, I stand by my original suggestion, which is let's just call the other guy also create and then just say, the people that actually turn on trimmer warnings may or may not get a warning. And that seems reasonable.
If they call the overload that's marked unsafe, they'll get a warning. Yep.
Yeah. So basically ignore those two, the plus and minus, and assume we're just going to add that linker warning to the existing create.
Yep.
But also add all the other overloads.
Right, for sure. Yeah. One other FYI, one other small benefit of doing the separate create methods is we can auto assign a converter, because we know, hey, you're calling the int, create with an int, for example, and we can get the int converter and we don't have to do a dictionary lookup. So it actually does help in a roundabout way performance, because then we don't have to do dictionary lookup later.
All right. Does anybody have feelings about the operator completion? I think it's fine.
So remind me again, Json Element is the one that we used to have, right? And JSON Node is the new one, right?
Json Element is the thing that I wrote that nobody can figure out how to use, but has really good perf.
It's this union type that basically lets you access arbitrary contents, right?
Yeah, and at any given time, 80% of the members throw.
And so there's an implicit conversion from an element to a node, and implicit conversion from the element
an explicit from the node
see.
to the.
This pattern exists for every single known type as well that you see above.
So, but why is one of them is implicit, one is explicit?
One is creating a JSON node, and one's creating a element, right? From a node. So
but the implicit one is the one that allocates, right?
The explicit one can throw, and the implicit one can't.
Yeah, I guess my question is why would so you're basically saying one throws, one doesn't throw. Why does one throw potentially?
For JSON element, I don't know that it would, but for something like int, it would be because your JSON node doesn't represent an int.
Well,
oh, I see.
An int can always become a JSON node, so that's a safe conversion, so it was implicit, but not all JSON nodes can become ints, so that's an explicit or explicit conversion.
Which is just it's a common pattern, right? I think.
Well, yeah, I was under the impression that they're both safe, but if one of them throws, clearly that needs to be an explicit conversion.
It's an implementation detail, but JSON element, the explicit operator, can throw if the JSON node you're passing in is an object, JSON object or JSON array. We don't have to throw there, but if you're going to create a JSON node that's based upon a JSON element, that's an object or an array, then you should pass that JSON element, or what am I trying to say here? you should basically use the version that you should use JSON object when the element when the JSON element is an object, and you use JSON array when the element is an array. So there's some implementation logic here, but
I would say if you throw in any case, you should not make it an implicit conversion.
Yeah.
Like implicit conversion should always succeed. Like if they ever throw, no matter how remote, then there should be always be explicit.
Well, I mean, we're not consistent about that, to be honest.
The other requirement.
Well, we should.
The other requirement should be that it's lossless.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
And if you implicitly convert and you lose data, that's bad, and that causes no end of bugs filed against me because C# allows int to convert to float, and that sometimes loses data.
Yep.
Yeah, but who cares about those fractions?
Apparently everyone, according to Tanner's bug list.
So in an ideal world, like I absolutely agree with Tanner, like implicit conversion should never be lossy.
That's in our guidelines.
I would be willing to fudge a little bit that implicit conversions shouldn't throw, and it makes me want to take a shower to say that. But we do have precedent for that. Like casting a T array to a span of T is an implicit conversion and can throw. But it throws so rarely, whatever. It's generally useful for people to have the implicit conversion and ignore the 0.5% chance it could fail.
I mean, I buy that part. Like, if it's really remote and you have to do something crazy to get there, like, sure. But like, I think your case is probably the array covariance problem, right? But somebody did something. Yeah.
Yes, and that's something that we would say is rare enough where let's not punish the typical use case. At least it's not lossy.
Mm-hmm. A thing we wouldn't even have if we started the framework over now.
But in your example, if you say like for certain kinds in the hierarchy, I succeed. Like I don't know, primitives work, but if it's an object that throws, well, that seems like not that unlikely to run into, right?
Yeah, that's fair. Okay. And I don't, to be honest, I don't know what that cutoff would be. Like I don't know if it's 99.5%, 99%, whatever. But I guess I'm just trying to make the argument there probably is a cutoff that we're comfortable with, even if we can't articulate it right now.
I mean, ultimately, anything can throw, right? Like eventually you run out of memory or stack overflow or whatever, right? It's just that at that point you just stop caring.
And by the way, my description of the throwing capability of JSON element wasn't correct in the sense that if you pass in a JSON element that is based upon a JSON object or JSON array, it should create the proper JSON node. It won't throw. Create on JSON value, however, is different because that has to return a JSON value.
Yeah. But does the node to element direction ever throw?
In this case, it should have to know.
So we could be implicit if we wanted to, but if all the other out conversions are explicit, we can leave it that way for symmetry until someone complains. / never get around to changing it.
It just seems odd to me that we're saying, because basically if JSON node and JSON element are effectively the same concept, then it seems odd that one is explicit and one is implicit. Like if anything, I would have expected the allocation one to be explicit and the non-allocation one to be implicit, but it's the other way around. So like I would probably say like we probably should make them both implicit then. Like I don't know why you would make one side write the cast.
Again, for all the other things, it makes sense that you're losing data. I don't know if there's any data here to lose. I know JSON element can't look up. I think JSON nodes can, so you might lose data unless it's just a boxing and unboxing thing. Like JSON elements you can't get to your parent in the JSON graph from a JSON element.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd call that lossy. Like that's just you're different DOMs, right?
Fair enough. But then if you go back to a JSON node, if you go from a JSON node to a JSON element to a JSON node, if you've lost data, then somewhere in there you lost data, and that should have been an explicit conversion. So if you can't round trip faithfully, then somewhere you needed some parentheses.
I see. So then, but then that begs the question: how do I go from a JSON element to a JSON node implicitly? If one has if the JSON element doesn't have a parent, how do you manufacture the parent in the node you're giving me back?
I think it makes up that was the root. It has no parent.
It temporarily doesn't have a parent, and then when you assign it, it gets assigned a parent.
Because you're creating a new node out of nothing, or rather out of structure.
I see. Okay.
So.
But it also means if I have an existing JSON node, I make an element out of it, and then I go back to a JSON node, and we'll get back a different instance, right?
Yeah, so that seems like a good reason to be explicit. Somewhere in the chain, and this is the place that makes the most sense.
To go. So yeah, because if you go from a JSON node to a JSON element, you're going into the non-parenthood representation, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
And then when you cast back, you now have a completely detached JSON node particle, and it can't answer the question that the first one could. So.
And in theory, if JSON element has some JSON value kind or some kind of weird type, a pointer, I'm just making something up, I don't know. That's not supported by JSON node, it could throw. I don't know. I don't think that's true today, but Jeremy, are you aware of any weird types that JSON element supports?
I mean, we handle null differently, but otherwise.
Right. But in theory, they don't have to match, right? I mean, technically, they could diverge. So, yeah. I mean, that's not true today, but.
I mean, they are all just representing JSON, but.
How do I go from one to the other without calling the casting operator? Is there a method on it?
Go from JSON node to JSON element, or
yeah, is it like an as node or to node, or is there constructor? Well, usually we say like we have another way of doing it.
There is a constructor that takes it.
Yeah, so long there's an obvious way of doing it, which is either new or calling an instance method.
Yeah, so if you look at JSON object or JSON array,
you don't seem to have any constructors on this guy though. So yeah, which makes sense because it's an abstract thing, right?
So this
that's kind of bad.
Let's create from an element.
Know the type to instantiate it.
But how do you get a JSON element currently if you have a JSON node? Or is that just you have to run through the serializer?
Yeah, well, you can either use the cast operators that or you go through the serializer.
Okay, but right now you don't have the cast operator, so the question was, what's the current code that this is representing, and it's walking through the serializer.
Okay, so if you have a JSON value, or JSON node in general, and you want to get a JSON element. That's the question?
Yes.
Right now,
if we said no new operators, then what's the code someone writes?
Other than the serializer, perhaps, I mean, a roundabout way of doing it with JSON, I don't think it's possible. It's primarily intended for incoming, right? Interop with JSON element.
Yeah, I don't think anybody pushes back on the feature. It's more like we generally have the guidance that says if there is something you can do with a casting operator, you should be able to do the same thing without relying on the casting operator because they're not part of the normal API surface, right? Like the problem is they're basically undiscoverable. You have to know that you can invoke them. Implicit ones are usually somewhat discoverable so long people have a feel for what is compatible, right? There's an implicit, upcast or whatever. But like if you know, say, oh, you have this super efficient way to go from one to the other, and we expose it as casting operators, you may have no customers, right? So you that's why you usually want to have like a .as node or as element instance method, for example, that would do the exact same thing, right? So that people can actually know that they can do it.
Because you're creating a copy, but
yeah. I mean, the interesting thing is that when you create a JSON node through a parse method, it is backed by a JSON element. And purposely, you can't easily get that out because if we allow you to get it out in that case, that's fine because it's already there. But if you want to create one, because you created a new DOM, for example, and you created, a JSON object, and you want to get a JSON element out of that, basically the only way to do it programmatically is to get the JSON and then pass it to the, JSON document.parse or JSON serializer.parse. Or deserialize whatever, and do it that way. There is no one-to-one mechanism to no efficient way to do that. But you can. But if you specify JSON element as a value to JSON value, if you pass in, because you can specify in the create methods here. Then you can get the same value out. If that makes sense. You can get the JSON element out.
Fair enough.
I mean, it's not a round trippable thing, right? I mean, it's just like, why don't we have a way to get a POCO out of this? At one point, we had the get value method that we would have several layers of fallback. JSON value.get value. And let's say, okay, if the T value doesn't match, then, we're going to start looking at the JSON element. And if that doesn't match, we're going to call the serializer and do kind of this magic for you. And then basically based on some discussions, we decided that that's too much magic and we'll just keep it straightforward.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the only reason that I wonder if we don't want the implicit element to node is that could be a whole lot of particle allocations. Like, if your JSON element represents a very large structured document, the fact that JSON node will create a different object for each individual portion of that document, like, you could go from you have one tightly compacted thing to you just created over 1 million objects. That's a lot for what looked like you passed a parameter.
It doesn't happen right away though. So basically, there's a direct reference to that element, and then as you navigate your tree and you navigate to other objects or arrays, or you ask for
so they're lazy
counter value or something like that, then arrays explode, objects explode, but it's still lazily done throughout the whole tree.
Okay. I guess that's fine then.
So the performance actually of this method versus JSON element is about the same, like within 1%, because it just keeps a copy of JSON element until you start navigating or asking for values.
Fair enough.
Yeah, that seems fine. I mean, the only thing I would say is like it seems, I don't know, like how often do people have to pass across the boundary, right? Like if you think it's substantially rare, I would probably I would probably just not have conversion operators. I would probably just have, an instance method that gives you one. Like, I mean, for span and array, we are doing it because people pass them around a lot. And so we don't want to write the code every single time. But for, these things, we have two different DOMs. Like, how often do you go back and forth between them? And that seems not that common, right?
Yeah, I think JSON element makes a lot of the most sense when it's the input value and not necessarily the output value.
JSON element being the input value. So the idea is you wanna add an element to the tree, for example, or you wanna.
Oh well, JSON element is read only, but it's very performant. So if you happen to get a hold of a JSON element, maybe you're using JSON document and an iDisposable pattern and all of that goodness, and then you find a certain node that you want to start now editing. You can do that by passing in the JSON element to these operators or the create method, and then modify it and then serialize it or call the serializer, whatever you want. I don't think the opposite is that true. Like if you have a JSON node and then now you want to get a JSON element for some reason. I mean, the only possible reason I would think that you'd want to do that is if you have some existing code somewhere that takes a JSON element, you want to pass it. But I think that would be the 1% case.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, like, for your first scenario, like, how would I get the node? And basically, I would have to write effectively a cast in my code, right? I would say var node equals, JSON node, like open parenthesis, JSON node, close parenthesis, my value, right?
Well,
right, if I'm standing on the JSON element, then I don't want to get a mutable DOM.
Right. So right now that would be. You have to know if your element is an array, an object, or other, and then you would call JSON array, JSON object, or JSON value dot create with the node or with the element. So the implicit conversion he's adding just does that check for you.
Right. So again, I'm not advocating for not having that mechanism. I'm just saying, I think that mechanism being a cast operator is just not discoverable. Like if I'm standing on an element, do I know that I can just cast it to a node? I don't think so. I mean, it's not necessarily super intuitive. It would be way more intuitive to say I'm standing on an element and I can say dot to node, right? And then I get back a JSON node. That to me makes a lot more sense as a consumer. Or I mean, even like to have a JSON node static factory method, you can say JSON node.create and you pass in the element. That's also fine, right? Because those are the places I would probably be looking for, right? I would not magically try to cast and see what that.
Yeah, there should be parity on. There should be a corresponding method, and there isn't for the create. So, I mean, other than what you're looking at here, that you have to know what type you're.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like we decided that it should be the individual one so that you can get the rich types back. All right. So are we just saying no to the operators now and figure out the scenarios and bring it up in a different proposal? Because it was kind of tacked on to the bottom of this one.
Yeah, exactly. I think. I mean, in fact, we could create, add some static create methods to JSON node instead of JSON value, right? And that would make more sense, actually, for JSON value.
I have another question about this API when we are done with this topic.
I was about to say, I was hoping we were done, and now you're asking more questions.
Were we done with this, or was there more to discuss?
I think so. I mean, the two changes, right? One is called create with serializable value, whatever, just create, and then remove those 4 new overloads for now.
So my new question is JSON array.add creates a JSON value of t. So did we need to put overloads on there? Do we need to do something special here?
JSON array.add is void?
Of t. This one.
Oh, you mean, okay.
This one's going to call these unsafe API, basically.
Right. Okay. You're actually asking about the create method relevant thing, not the operators that sidetrack.
Well, this would be
right. That's what I was saying. I have a different question about the whole.
Okay, so this is another trimming potential issue. That's what you're saying.
So the implementation of JSON array.add of t calls new JSON value of t.
Mm-hmm.
So if you pass in person or customer or whatever into that JSON array of add.
No, you're passing in the instance already though, right?
Yep, and you're going to turn around and serialize it.
But since you already created the instance, this is the same case for the create. I mean, for the toJSON string, you already know based upon how the constructor was called whether it's safe for trimming or not.
No, because internally JSON array.add is calling new JSON value of t.
Yeah, I mean, I think the easier answer is, I think Eric is right that we have add of JSON node, that one's totally fine, and then we have add of t that was added as a convenience mechanism,
right.
And either it needs to be similarly exploded, which is gonna make emo say I told you so, or we just delete it because we haven't shipped it yet.
Or we put the attribute on this one, right?
Or we just delete it.
Where do we have add?
Like anybody who wants this as a shortcut can add it as an extension method.
This was requested by the Azure team actually, but
it's a 3-line extension method if they don't care about trimming.
Right.
Well, I mean,
all you do is call JSON value.create or before it, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think that might make sense to remove that.
Well, we don't need to remove it. We would just annotate it as this is unsafe.
Well, okay, we can remove it, or we can, add the attribute to it.
Yeah, it's fine. I mean, I guess what's weird is I guess you would just put in remarks on the member that if you care about trimming, then replace this with a call to add of JSON node.create.
Yeah, usually we stick those in the message of the requires unreferenced code attribute, but
okay.
So that way when you get the warning, you get it in the warning.
Fair enough. But yeah.
Okay, so I missed that there was a JSON node overload, I guess. So this satisfies my question completely.
Okay, so I mean we can take this offline because we've added the trimmability attribute to hundreds of places already.
Yeah.
Some quick comments on this that Jeremy has written. Don't forget to add the not null if not null attributes and blah 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 where appropriate.
I don't know that any of them.
Oh.
I guess GUID. No, because GUID's a struct. All the things that are nullable are. I don't think not null if not null applies to nullable if t. I thought that was only if it was a reference question mark.
Oh, I thought the compiler had special understanding of nullable of t. Okay, never mind.
I could be wrong, but I don't think so. I thought that the nullable annotation things and nullable of t are basically orthogonal, aside from they both use question mark.
Okay.
I actually don't remember. I think you're right, Jeremy, but so basically it's a suggestion that basically instead of having both overloads, you basically just have it's null when you gave me null, and if you gave me null, it's null.
Well, I think it's would want int question mark, but it's the not null if not null, whatever the syntax for this guy is.
Yeah,
to say if your int was not the nullable int, then I promise I will give you a JSON value. But if you give me the nullable int, then I will give you a null JSON value.
I see. Yeah, you can't do that because they're different types, right? So this only works for the reference types cases because it's the same type, and you just describe runtime behavior, right? Which for nullable doesn't make a sense, right? Because if you give me a non-null int,
then you're not calling.
Well, I guess I can give you. I guess you could apply it to a nullable int, right? Because then they say the nullable int I give you back, I promise it's not going to be null, right? You could do that probably, but I'm not sure how much value that is adding.
Okay, yeah, like I'm not suggesting changing the API surface, just saying like since we're adding these APIs and since we care about nullability, just make sure the annotations are correct is really all it is.
No, I agree with that.
Yep. All right. So I don't think there are any other nullable annotations that we need. And then this comment is out of date, so
I
I'll
haven't
delete it.
checked. I assume the list is complete though, right? That's all the types we intrinsically understand in JSON, right?
And if not, there'll be some stragglers that we can approve over email.
Yeah, we need to cycle on this for other new types like date only, time only, and things like that as well.
Time span. I don't know why, but to me, time span, I run into this all the time for some reason. Maybe because I have very specific needs, but.
Okay. I think this is right now.
All right, thank you.
That was fast.
Okay. Hey, Emo.
All right.
You still haven't made clicking on things work.
No, I have not.
Okay.
And keystrokes still get eaten. It's the worst. I don't care about clicking. I don't eat my keystrokes.
I care more about the clicking than the keystrokes. Fix my bug first. Fight.
All right.
Type.
Next issue.
All right, Laomi, I assume yours is too long, right?
I don't think he's here.
Okay.
Laomi did hang up, but he said to ping him if you're going to review his.
Yeah,
issue.
but we only have 10 minutes left, so. All right.
Is the next one 10 minutes?
All right. Hey, backlog. Synchronize, deserialize, and serialize to a stream using JSON serializer. 1574. It's a 4-digit number. How cute.
Oh, that makes sense to me, yeah.
Have I thumbed up this yet?
So this is, we already have the asyncs and they just want to add the syncs?
Yeah.
Right. It should follow the existing pattern. That was the intent.
It seems legit to me. Why?
I mean, it makes sense, right?
Why don't we currently have synchronous versions of this? Was this opinionated?
Because we only added it for.
It was not considered part of the minimum viable product in 3.0.
Okay, so.
We should have ones that take in the JSON type info, the source gen stuff.
That's a good point. Yeah, this was created before that.
Yeah, I assume so.
I don't know that those exist yet, so I'll just reference that they should be added as well.
We also added in 6.0 a deserialize async enumerable method to JSON serializer. Presumably, we want deserialize enumerable.
Well, that's special for async enumerable. Like that is its own special beast. I don't think it needs a different flavor.
Okay. So you don't want the ability to pull off values one at a time. You still want only the ability to deserialize the whole object in a single shot, right?
I mean, I just remember the whole reason it got a different name is because it behaves fundamentally differently than the rest of the things, and that I think we discussed should it have a synchronous version, and we couldn't make sense out of it.
Okay, sounds good.
Is my recollection.
I'm surprised the Azure SDK hasn't asked that yet.
By the way, we've had to work around this issue internally. We have some HTTP extensions for ASP.NET, and we have to do some ugly threading hacks, wait methods that can go away once we have this. So it'll help clean up some internal code as well.
Boom. I guess I can indent those things. I think I got it.
And do you have the comment in there about JSON type info then, or no?
Also add the overloads for.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Looks good.
And
all right.
And one day GitHub will have the ability to indent.
It does. You highlight and you hit tab, and it adds 2 spaces. So you have to do it twice.
What?
Yeah.
It did it? That must be new, because that has not been there for a long time.
Somewhere after you lost the ability to host the streams, somebody had commented in chat that it totally worked, and then I tried it and was flabbergasted. So, thank you, chat.
Yeah, that totally changed everything. All right, looks good.
All right, we still have 10 minutes.
Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy.
Let's approve some martial art ones.
Isledasm.
I've not looked at this.
This will take more than 10 minutes.
Really?
Yeah.
Why? I thought we already agreed on email that let's just fucking do it.
Yeah. I was just going to get approved.
Okay, sure. Okay, yes. Great. It didn't take more than 10 minutes. I'm happy.
The only question is, does it warrant its own diagnostic ID?
Nah, you have 1 occurrence per assembly, dude. That's fine.
Okay.
I mean...
There was an open question, and maybe this is a separate issue, but there was an open question as to like whether we wanted ILDASM to just ignore it, or have a force parameter to ignore it, or whatever. But is this not the right group for that then?
So I think there's a different question here, which is kind of like, I think this was the point that Morten made earlier, right? He thinks that's a bad idea. My personal view on this is like, I think the attribute was a bad idea, not the deprecation of it is a bad idea, because fundamentally there is critical mass of obfuscators that don't honor it today. So I think there's just no point in doing that. Like if you actually care about your IP, just don't write it in .NET or obfuscate it, right? Like basically these are the 2 options you have, right? And so I feel like this thing gives you a false sense of honest people being honest. And so like I don't know what the point of that is. And it also blocks legitimate uses, right?
So
that's
yeah,
and discussion we had.
And to be perfectly honest, like whatever we make ildasm.exe do, like is really, it's really a separate question of whether this API should die or not. Okay, sure.
Yep.
Fair enough. I'm sold.
I don't understand this one I understand the concept from a glance. I think it'll probably take longer than 10 minutes, though.
This one's actually pretty straightforward, actually. I think we can get this in under 10 minutes. Basically, when you call marshal.alloc right now, like we have a bunch of allocation APIs, but they don't guarantee any type of alignment. Say that you really need something to be 8-byte or 16-byte aligned. I think as an implementation detail, some of the alloc methods might say, sure, it's always going to be 8-byte aligned, but maybe that's only an implementation on a specific operating system or on a specific architecture, blah blah blah. And if you really need alignment, like we right now force you to do it manually, these are going to be APIs, accelerator APIs, that wrap the underlying C runtime aligned allocation routines. This will be useful if you're doing stuff like putting vector values or doubles or something in memory, things that really could benefit from having that alignment. There was discussion in the issue as to whether we should guarantee that these call into the underlying C runtime API, and I believe the conclusion from that discussion is that we should in fact make that guarantee.
Yeah, Jan and I were in favor of just saying that these are C runtime. The C runtime provides a minimal amount of guarantees and doesn't run into the same issues that alloc H global, for example, does, where it's tied to an operating system specific API and therefore it's a breaking change to do basically anything in the future.
Yeah, I originally had pushback to saying that they called into the C runtime until Jan and Tanner kind of explained in the thread that it's typical nowadays to have exactly one runtime per process, and you don't have nowadays situations where two different libraries will load two different versions of the runtime. I mean, if you've statically linked, like, more power to you, I guess, but that's just not a thing that happens now.
Notably, Jan raised three questions in the issue here. The first one, should the APIs return void star instead of int pointer? We've been leaning towards using actual pointers for pointers to buffers. My vote was yes, we should be returning void star here. Should the APIs take the buffer size as an in uint rather than an inint, so unsigned? My vote was also yes. There's no reason to limit this to 2 gigabytes on a 32-bit process, nor to artificially mismatch from the C API, which we're basically doing a one-to-one correspondence with. And the last one is, should we just call these alloc and free, and alloc aligned and alloc and aligned free, or should we actually, append it with memory, like is in the top post here? And my vote was also, we should just call this alloc, realloc, free. Those are the simple, API names used in every low-level language out there.
Alloc,
the standard name malloc?
Free seems kind of open for interpretation.
Yeah, free memory is fine.
Just because Marshall doesn't implicitly manage allocations, so when you call Marshall.free, what does that mean?
That was a question that I raised separately that no one else really had any input on, which was, if you look across what most standard native allocators provide, there's actually a number of methods in addition to the ones listed here. And therefore, should we actually define like a separate memory utilities class or something? And I did not suggest a name. Basically just a static class on interop services that is separate from Marshall, whose whole purpose is any of these memory management functions.
Yeah, I
think that's probably a good idea.
Yeah, like honestly, my preference would be that whatever allocate things we have, they don't return void star, they don't return int pitter. What they return is safe handle, because then they've already hooked up what's the right free for you, and then you can get the int pitter and then thus the void star out of it.
I think
if you want.
I think that's a non-starter for the purpose of this API.
But on Marshall that doesn't fit, so it would go somewhere else.
Yeah, and to be honest, a lot of safe pointers are actually written on top of these APIs.
Sure.
Sorry, a lot of safe handles are written on top of these APIs.
Right, and so you would need these in order to power the safe handle. But but once we start adding, I'm guessing on Linux, because when I looked at the man page for POSIX mem-aligned, it didn't talk about a separate free. So I think on POSIX systems, free aligned and free are going to be the same thing, but on Windows they seem to be different, and so seems like we're just creating room for problems. Yes, Windows already had the same thing with alloc co-task versus alloc h global, and I think that, again, it would be nice in the we all have infinite time universe that we just expose the safe handle version so that things took care of this for you.
Right. So POSIX does have, I don't remember if it's aligned _ free or free _ aligned. It does define it. Okay. It's basically an optimization, and free is supposed to work for your aligned allocations regardless. It may just do additional logic to determine what block you're in rather than assuming that it's already at the start of the block.
Okay. Because the man page I found mentions free, but not any special variant of free. So.
Yeah, I actually have a list a little bit further down of, for example, Microsoft publishes memalloc, which is a native memory management alternative to the C runtime functions, and it provides POSIX and Windows compat for a lot of functions. And I listed all the variants that exist, and therefore what we might we could theoretically add in the future if enough people ask for different variants.
Yeah. The other thing to keep in mind, and maybe this is a minor concern, is that this now forever ties us to the C runtime. Just FYI.
I don't think that's an issue. Every ABI in the world is tied to the C runtime. Even Rust is tied limitedly to the C runtime in terms of malloc and free. Like Windows is fundamentally tied to it, and anything that they replace in the future is either going to be completely breaking or will have some kind of C runtime compat layer.
Sounds good.
I mean, even that, I'm not even sure I buy that. Like, if there's a fundamental reason why we can't support the C runtime interop layer, I would just deprecate that type. Like, you look at the Marshall type, right? A lot of the stuff on it is like tied to Windows, and guess what? We still go cross-platform just fine, right? You just make certain things throw, right? Worst case.
So did we decide that we're using int pointer instead of void star?
So I think we should use int PTR because that's what everything else on Marshall does.
Just for consistency.
Consistency above whatever Tanner's argument is.
Yeah, I think that we should have a different class, and we should not use int pointer because every single person is going to have to cast. Also, int pointer has a fundamental problem in that it is a signed type, and pointers are not signed. Pointers are unsigned, and you can run into all kinds of issues if you don't use it correctly.
I mean, the only reason why NPTR was used on Marshall was so people don't have to be in unsafe context to just pass it around, right? But like, I mean, whoever uses these APIs clearly needs a pointer at the end of the day, so they might as well give them the pointer.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know what else you would do with that.
I mean,
you would allocate memory and then give it to somebody else.
Again, things like safe handle, right? Safe handle is powered by int PTR, and so if you do make an int PTR out of these, then now you have to turn the void star into an int PTR, which yes is not hard, but it's still int PTR is our I'm writing semi-safe code, and this is a pointer. Don't look at it. Like
but if you're touching Marshall, you're already dealing with unsafe code, and half the APIs take unsafe variants anyways now. Like the whole push from the runtime team is to move towards more explicitly unsafe code, because this semi-safe code that looks safe but it's really not, just it is a pit of failure, 100%.
It was the reason for it is because we were using code access security instead of unsafe in order to do enforcement. But code
also
access
CLS
security
compliance.
Yeah, but that's all dead at this point. Yeah.
Like the runtime team is even saying, like, we're not going to be extending some of the new features on to support delegate, because guess what? Users should use function pointers, not delegate now.
Yeah, I would agree. Like, we should just do the right thing going forward instead of trying for consistency, which also means nuance instead of mint.
Yeah, I mean, I would like so. I'll cave easily, but my feeling is if you're on the same type, you should follow the same pattern, and if we made a new type, then it can be the new pattern. Like, I'm not saying it needs to be we don't use pointers anywhere. It's we don't use pointers on Marshall allocators. Like, that's my statement. This is really close to all those other allocs, and it behaves it has a different feeling, and that feels wrong to me, but I don't care enough.
That's fair, and that's totally fair, to be honest.
If someone has has a name suggestion other than Marshall, like I would have suggested memory Marshall, but that's an existing thing for span.
Native Marshall or unmanaged Marshall or something.
Yeah,
like that.
Maybe I would just call it native memory.
Yeah, I was about
native
to say
memory dot alloc, native memory dot free. Like, seems like a reasonable type.
Yeah, that would allow us to add like calloc in the future, or Zalek, or any of the other alternatives. So
still under interop services.
Yeah, interop services.
Oh yeah.
Native memory, alloc free, realloc, aligned alloc, aligned free.
I'm fine with that. Like, that clearly mimics the CRT.
Yeah. I like it.
Now, is it?
Let me check that.
For realloc, is it capital A or lower A?
Troll.
I know how I would do it, and it's not what's written on the screen here.
Yes.
But how I do it is not always what the framework design guidelines say.
So, I believe that it should be a lowercase a if we did not already have realloc as having capital A on Marshall. Now that it's not on Marshall, there's room for discussion. On Marshall, it should obviously follow the pattern.
There's a P invoke Marshall that has reallocate memory with lowercase a.
Yeah, so I think we should, reallocate is an English word. So, and re is not an English word. I mean, Ray is a word because of email. But, yeah, I think...
So just for full disclosure, someone in YouTube chat did mention that native memory will clash with native span if it's ever added. I don't think this is a huge issue, to be honest, because this is going to be in a different namespace.
And this would be native memory and not native memory of T.
Yes.
So.
Excuse me, what is native span?
If we have an int linked span instead of just int.
Right.
It's some North Star feature we're all wishing would be done, but we don't have the energy to do it.
I see.
Yeah, it's that thing where when we ship span, someone should have very strongly fought for this should be int pointer, and we should force the language team to support inint in the next release. And guess what? Like 2 releases later, the C# team supported native int. Now we're stuck with an API.
We could have just said it's long and made 32-bit platforms say we don't care, or then we just say we don't care about you 32-bit platform.
No, that's still problematic. It needs to be inint.
I'm just what we could have done at the time.
Things came in the wrong way. It happens.
Is there any reason why we can't have an indexer that also takes an int now?
On span? That's a separate conversation.
Yeah, we could definitely have indexers that take native int. Like array, for example, implicitly supports int, uint, long, ulong, inint, and inuint.
And it turns out it's broken.
Yes.
Yes.
So we probably could and should add the equivalent overloads on span just for consistency with array, but outside of that, it doesn't buy a lot other than you don't have to downcast when you input. You still can't actually allocate and do things with indexes that long, so the usefulness is a micro optimization to remove a 0 or sign extension.
I see, Jeremy, you have question marks for the alignment parameter. Is it because you're thinking alignment? Well, what's the CRT API for that?
There is not a direct C runtime equivalent for it. It is a C runtime extension that is commonly provided. And
I see that size T.
Yeah.
So it should be nuint.
Yeah, that's
also
what I was.
Strictly speaking, alignment comes before size.
Really? Because I'm looking at
Windows is size alignment
Windows.
and POSIX is alignment size.
So in C11 there is now an official aligned _alloc, and it is inuint alignment inuint size.
I see that. Okay.
Yeah, that would be this here. It looks like it was added in C11.
Yeah, we should.
Surprised they don't take a character.
I know they're not overloads, but alloc just takes a byte count. And so if I want to go to alloc aligned, it feels like the byte count should go in the same place.
Yeah, but this is I'd argue. So I say yes, but also that because this is basically a 1-to-1 with the C runtime exposed APIs, it's probably better to match that. I don't have a strong preference though. It's probably going to bite people either way.
Yeah, it's kind of like the copy. How does the source or the dest come first?
Yeah,
it always bites people.
And I can't think of anything clever we can do with types to help.
No, the easiest thing to do would just be to whenever we call it in our own code, we should get in the habit of probably using named parameters. That way people who are copying and pasting might do the same thing.
There's that proposal for F# and also to extend it to C# for a requires named parameters attribute.
Fun.
All right. So I agree with Eric that I think that byte count should go first. And I agree with Tanner that if C11 says alignment goes first, then we should just put the alignment first, and Windows is the one with the twist, and we just shrug. So I moved alignment first. Somebody tell me if I should move it back. Cool.
Yeah.
And I think this covers the basics, and there's room for exposing like calc and other equivalents in the future.
So
by the standard C library names?
The C library name is called aligned alloc, not alloc aligned.
Yeah, we should match the C names. Would be my preference. Because I mean, otherwise, adding new C style methods gets harder and harder if they have different naming conventions from ours. And given that this is really an API that is used for people that are coming from the C, I would just use the C names.
But is it for alloc? That's technically malloc.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm even fine with calling it malloc, to be honest. Like, whatever the name is, I would call it. I mean, it's
just
not that alloc
is
a
with a lowercase m. Like malloc with a lowercase m.
I wouldn't go that far. I mean, I think to me it's just like like match the name. So when you know what the name is, you can find it, right? I mean, casing, I would still kind of make it so that it doesn't look like a complete like wart in your code when you call it.
So if you're looking at the standard set of C dynamic memory management functions, the only one we've not exposed from the standard list is calc. Should we just go ahead and expose that today?
If somebody wants it, yeah. I mean, I have no idea what these do, so.
So calc is just array allocation. You give it a num and a size, and it does the index calculation of num times size, and any additional alignment.
It also zeros. That's one of the big things.
Yeah, that's the other thing. Is it calc zeros, whereas malloc leaves it undefined. And then there's the standard set of extensions like zalloc, which is a malloc that zeros.
Yeah.
But those ones are not part of the C standard.
So if we're saying that this API is for standards, then would we remove free aligned? Because alloc aligned, aligned alloc just goes with free.
I think the problem is you need to call free aligned on Windows.
Can't we actually target the actual honest to God like standard C APIs rather than going through Windows' thing, even on Windows?
Yeah, I believe we could.
If Windows has them, then sure.
Yeah, the only question there would be is so because it wasn't added to C++ until 17, and for C we are C11 compliant, but not the optional part. So if it's an optional API, it may not exist. But we can always check, and if it does exist, not expose free aligned, and if it does, then we would expose it and call it aligned free.
I mean, it depends on what it's called.
Well, on Windows, it's free aligned, but if we're matching the ordering of the C names, then I would imagine it'd be aligned _free.
Well, I thought this was supposed to take 10 minutes. Sorry, everyone.
I said it took 25. And counting.
It's definitely not the longest. So.
I mean, I would argue that half the marshalling APIs are because somebody did not take 10 minutes.
Aligned, the _aligned _free that Windows exposes. Oh, and Windows is aligned free. It's aligned _free.
Yes, you're right.
Yeah. But specifically, Windows says don't use free because it may not clean up correctly. So
Great.
so yeah. So we'll just we'll check, and if Windows doesn't support, we'll expose both.
To be honest, like I'm kind of surprised the regular C runtime uses a standard free function, but whatever.
Yeah.
All right, and we're gonna add
we
calc.
Yeah, which is the only one missing from the standard set. Looking at the page here.
Yeah, I mean it also behaves in a completely different way, but sure.
Yeah, but it gives us that, you want C runtime functionality. Here's your one-to-ones, num and then size. Yep. Element count.
That's what I called it.
Oh yeah. Never mind. Element byte count. I don't like that. I'm not particularly picky here, and I don't want to take up time, but I don't like that it's size versus byte count.
But
I mean, size out.
Byte count is the count of bytes you want to allocate. Calc is weird because it multiplies these.
Right.
And then clears it. So it is the count of the number of elements you want, and then how big is each element. That's the POSIX calls it nellum and else's. So yes, I'm aware it's L size, but
num and size is the C standard.
Yeah.
And then size instead of byte count, but I'm not particularly picky here.
But I think this is fine what you have, honestly.
Yeah, because this is just called ELSIZE in POSIX, and then this is in elem. Instead of using the in prefix, we use the count suffix, and then this just turns EL into element. So that's how I came up with the names.
People who call these APIs will probably know what they do, would be my guess.
Right. So.
All right, then hit approve.
Oh.
Do it.
And then Jan will comment and tell us why this is all a bad idea.
Sure.
I love that we're giving Adam like all this crazy work that he probably never signed up for, because this issue is somehow assigned to him.
Well, he's passionate about new allocations. Now let's give him some APIs to allocate memory.
But they don't show up in profiling because they're not GC heap allocations.
Right.
Exactly. So we only measure managed heap. We don't care about native heap. So one thing is like on the last thing we just approved, the one where I said we don't need the diagnostic ID. Eric was questioning that, and on second thoughts, I agree with him. We should just give it the diagnostic ID, just for two reasons. One of them is it's just more consistent, and the other one is there is probably a topic that actually warrants its own help page, would be my guess, because it is a controversial, non-intuitive thing. So let's just add the diagnostic ID to it, whatever the next one in line is, and call it good.
Did I forget to mark this one approved? I did. That's going to shoot or destroy the video. Oh no, just it didn't. Undo close tab, didn't refresh it. Cool. There, now it said the whole thing was the right thing the whole time. All right, so yeah, good thing you didn't take that bed emo because we touched the backlog today.
Oh, good. And
the backlog.
Yeah, and the one that I want to talk about is first in the backlog. So hopefully we won't get more than 2 or 3 new red issues come in over the next few days.
Yeah, I'm proud of me for not jumping to ones that I care about. I control the screen, but
I
I'm
imagine Eric is looking forward to the one that's, what is that, like 4 or 5 down? Yeah.
4.
Yep.
I counted already. 4 non-blocking.
Yeah, it is hard for things to slip under in the non-blocking category because the issue number is monotonic. You'd have to hollow one out, which is cheating. Okay, I think it's
actually
lunchtime.
It's not sorted by issue number. I think it's sorted by creation date, but that's effectively the same as the issue ID. But yeah.
Fair enough. So, all right. So thanks for joining us, everyone. And oh wait, when are we next? Thursday?
Thursday or Friday, actually, because Thursday.
Because I've taken to
announce. Because Thursday I get my vaccination shot, so I assume that Just it's not going to happen.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Wednesday and Friday.
So so we will see anyone who wants to join us tomorrow at 10 a.m.
Otherwise, to just walk them in the order you see it on the screen right now.
Sounds good.
That's what Emo made this extremely democratic tool for.
Well, I just codified the rules we were supposed to use. So but I mean, it's still, there's still some room for interpretation, right? Because I sort by creation date, which isn't always the fairest. Realistically, we should sort by when it was marked API ready for review last. And that's not as trivial, unfortunately. So I don't do that. But that's probably would be more fair to the process.
Yep. All right.
Off the backlog, I could mark my issues as milestone 6.
Well, right now that won't help you much because there's a ton of milestone 6 issues.
All right. Well, I only have 21 and a half hours for lunch right now before our next meeting of this, so I'm signing off.
Good night.